What else was I going to say? I think we've kind of covered it. There was something, but it couldn't have been too important. I'm texting with Ron right now also, so sorry.
Jose, you're not teaching this summer, are you?
He's on mute. You're on mute, Jose.
Sorry. I am teaching, yeah. It's been nuts with the kids here. My son just had a tantrum. He got really mad at me. He's like, you always have work.
Actually, this is what's happening to me. Tons of it. Everything.
Yeah. It's going to keep happening until next year.
Yeah, exactly. No sign of ending.
Yeah.
How old is your son, Jose?
I have two. I have an 8-year-old and a 5-year-old. So the 5-year-old was supposed to start kindergarten. Probably won't happen. But,
I have a 5 and a 4-year-old.
That's right. Yeah.
My 4-year-old is the one having the tantrums.
Yeah.
Either that or when I'm on Zoom, he'll constantly go like this to my face while I'm talking to him.
Yeah.
Jean-Louis, sorry to interrupt. Jean-Louis, is Ron trying to enter?
No, they can totally go in by himself.
Say what?
I already resent the invite.
Okay, he says it says please wait. Did you just give him a general invite then?
No, it looked like he may have to register for it. That's the reason why. But if he checked his email, the K went to thesis@gmail.com. He should have an email coming from Layla. Tell him to click on that one. Or if he go into the attendee, just tell him to wait. I will upgrade him to a panelist right away.
He says he clicked on it. He says he clicked on whatever it is that we sent him.
No. Then he would go into there because it go through the panelists.
Try logging out and then click on the email from Layla, the login thing from Layla again.
Just close that window.
It shouldn't make a difference. If you just log out of everything, close everything down, and then click on Layla's thing, Layla's email, it should bring you in because we would be able to see you right now. Okay, what's your wife's name? He's gonna pop up as his wife's name. I'm gonna go ahead and hang up because we got to get started. So hopefully you'll be able to join. If not, I'll be texting with you and figure it out. Even if you just join as an attendee, you can see all the magic happening from behind the scenes. What's your wife's name? What's your wife's name gonna come up as? Jamie Ricardo. All right, thanks, bro.
You tag me.
So I think we're good, Jean. We just let us know when we need to be censoring ourselves. I feel like I should be telling jokes or something. There's so much silence. Like,
Okay, so I'm gonna launch a live now and then wait. I should wait.
Oh, maybe real quick. Is somebody
Okay,
going to be recording
broadcast.
this?
Yes, it's
Yeah.
recording.
Okay, good.
It's broadcast right now, so if you guys can sign on for 30 seconds, then get started.
All right. Well, I was told to hang out for 30 seconds, but honestly, I wasn't counting. So everybody, welcome to another Friday evening of political education. Super excited again to be able to have another really amazing panel. Those of you who know me know that I'm always really interested in kind of the connections between the local struggle and the efforts that we make locally. You know, in Southeast San Diego, and how those struggles are really similar, not only around the United States, but in other countries as well. And in some of the conversations and the classes that we've had leading up till tonight, you know, it's always been inevitable about a comment or somebody speaking about things that are happening in other countries. For example, the Philippines, Brazil, and the occupied territories of Palestine. And so today we invited some, you know, some scholars who I've heard amazing things about that I think will be able to really kind of open up that discussion for us. As you all know, when we do political education at Pillars, we don't have a particular ideology. It's not about this is the right way of thinking about the world, but really creating an environment that we can begin to think critically about a number of different issues and think through these issues and kind of broaden our understanding. If there was an ideology, it would be shit is complex. So please, everybody, you know, join me in welcoming this amazing panel. And I'm going to hand it off to Dr. Danny Widener and DJ Kuttin Kandi to help facilitate this evening's political education classes.
Thanks, Khalid, and welcome everyone. I want to just share my enthusiasm and happiness to be part of what I hope will be a really wide-ranging and helpful conversation for everyone who's trying to get a grasp a little bit on the conjunction between our long histories of struggle and the present moment we find ourselves in. What we're going to do, as generally, is ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves a bit, just give us a little bit of a sense of how they come to these questions of race, policing, state violence, American empire, with a little bit of perhaps a background on the particular area that they engage and study, and how these issues seem to be coming together in this present moment. So with that, I'll ask our first panelist, who is Dr. Stuart Schrader, who comes to us from Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. Be more it is in the house. Who's, well, I won't say anything else. That's the name, and I'll let you introduce yourself.
Thanks so much. It's really great to be here. This is something I've been looking forward to. So yeah, my name is Stuart Schrader, and I teach at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland. Johns Hopkins is an institution with a very complicated history that intersects with some of the issues that I think we're going to talk about tonight. But here at the university, I teach classes about policing, about racism, racial segregation, and they have been, you know, really, really great. And I've just been, over the past few weeks, really fortunate to have, you know, students being in touch with me and telling me that, you know, when they're talking to their families about defunding the police, they've been, you know, drawing on, you know, lectures or readings from my classes. So it's been, the past few weeks have been, you know, exciting and terrifying and everything else for so many people. But for me, you know, they've been particularly in some ways rewarding because I've found that my students have been, you know, going out into the streets and protesting and engaging with the issues. And so I'm really happy to bring some of my ideas to you today. And just the last thing I would say is that I work on, in my research, I work on policing in US empire. I wrote a book that came out last year called Badges Without Borders. And that book focuses on the Cold War, the period from basically 1945 to 1975. And it looks at how the United States trained and equipped police around the globe, primarily in so-called third world countries, in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. So I'll be happy to talk a little bit more about the book as we proceed.
Fantastic. Next, I'd like to introduce a second panelist who I'm also meeting for the first time, although I think we're pretty sure our paths have crossed now, and hopefully we'll again do so in the future. Dr. Robyn Rodrigues comes to us from UC Davis.
Thank you so much. I'm so very honored to be on this panel as well. You know, the institution that pays me is UC Davis, where I do teaching and I also do research. But really, in as much as my scholarly work does talk and speak to some issues related to kind of race and empire, perhaps less explicitly about policing. But I think if you kind of look at the whole of my work as a scholar activist and kind of where I draw my expertise as well from the on the ground work I've been doing for over half of my life in anti-imperialist spaces, particularly supporting movements really aimed at shedding light and rooting out the United States' continued neo-colonial dominance of the Philippines. That's really where my work kind of on policing, I think, kind of emerges, or sort of my expertise, if you will, having worked with groups like the Critical Philippinic Scholars Collective, where we did early work in the early 2000s already around the global war on terror, doing some work with the Malaya movement as well. So, you know, again, I think I come to the table with kind of multiple hats. I think it's, if you were to just do a search on my academic CV, it might not seem so straightforward why I come to here. But if you look at my activist CV, it's very, very much appropriate that I be in this space. I've been doing a lot of work with DJ Kuttin Kandi, trying to really bridge kind of these divides for us, really returning to the roots of ethnic studies and its movements, its rootedness in movements through this really great, amazing collaboration called the University for Justice and Liberation, which will be a free 6-week political education session. So, you know, if folks who are on this call really want to dive deeper into these issues, we'll have some opportunities to do that there. But thank you so much. I'm really happy to join the rest of you on this panel.
Fantastic, thank you. And please do give us the information about the seminar and we'll broadcast it and put it out to folks as well. Next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Jessica Graham, a dear colleague of mine here at UCSD. So I'll pass it over to you. I'll let you introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. Yes, I'm Jessica Graham. I teach in the Department of History at UC San Diego. And full disclosure, my work does not focus on policing or sort of empire in the traditional sense. I think what I have been pondering in terms of my contribution to the conversation is the role that policing does in particular with ideological work. So the ideological work of policing in terms of determining what is permitted and not permitted for activists to say, how they can articulate the ways in which they interact with the state. And so when you talk about a country like Brazil, so I should say that my work focuses on the impact of communism, fascism, Black activism, US-Brazil relations, and World War II on the formation and the ideals of racial democracy in the United States and Brazil from 1930 to 1945. So essentially during the Great Depression and World War II. And I think that my contribution in terms of my scholarship is thinking about the ways in which policing acts as a form of policing ideology. It acts as a form of policing the ways in which people express themselves politically, racially, the ways in which people can imagine a new potential economic system, the ways in which people can imagine new educational systems. And in the case of my work, it's specifically around the ways in which policing works to limit the ways in which people talk about the nation racially. So for those of you who don't know much about Brazil, I'll say that it's the country with the second largest African descendant population. There are more Black people in Brazil than any other place in the world outside of Nigeria. And historically, it has been based on this notion that it's a country that is free of discrimination, which, by the way, is an ideology that's common in many other Latin American countries as well. Jose can maybe talk about that as well, talking about Puerto Rico. But in particular, when you think about Brazil, what does it mean if you live in a country in which the nationalism is largely based on this notion that there's no discrimination, but there is discrimination. And when that nationalism of racial democracy becomes connected to the national security apparatus, that means that you are challenging and are a threat to national security just by pointing out the fact that there is racial discrimination. And so during the period that I study, this is when you first start to see a large number of political prisoners, largely people who are determined to be leftist or communist leaning. They're the ones who are most disproportionately affected by what's referred to as the political police in the 1930s and the 1940s, but also Black activists were disproportionately targeted as well. So you have a large number of Blacks who are in prison for fighting for their rights, fighting for Black freedom and Black equality. So thinking about, the sort of ideological work, again, of policing, I think is something that I can contribute, but obviously I'm prepared to talk about policing generally, the history of policing in Brazil, and talk as well about the historical moment that we're in. And I'll just end by saying, in terms of, what Khalid was saying at the beginning about the connections between what's happening locally here in San Diego, or also what's happening nationally with other countries in the world. There have always been strong connections between Black activists in the United States and Brazil. They've often looked to each other for ideas. The Black press in Brazil has published articles about the United States that were coming out from the Black press in the United States and vice versa. So there was a strong understanding about their similar racial histories and a willingness and a desire to try to work together and learn from one another in order to overcome racism. So that's my introduction, and I look forward to the conversation. I thank everyone for the invitation.
Thank you, Jessica. And last and very, very much not least, I wanted to ask Jose Fuste to introduce himself. Jose is a very long-time member of multiple radical political and cultural communities in San Diego. So I think, like Robyn, brings a lot of both those angles to the table. So please.
Thank you, Danny. Thank you for the invitation. I'm honored to be here. My name is Jose Fuste. I teach ethnic studies at UC San Diego. I'm from Puerto Rico originally, so my contribution will be about that and how it connects to what everybody else is talking about. What brought me here is I've been kind of obsessed and worried and engaged with the connections between colonialism and racism, but also the complexity of that. And the complexity of how, coming from Puerto Rico, colonialism is not just something that comes from outside, it very much is, but it's also something that we do to each other. And it's something that is deeply ingrained in how we see ourselves in the world. And it's deeply ingrained in how we relate to the government and to police, and how we criminalize certain people, how we police certain places, all of that. So yeah, I'm very much drawn to rethinking how the left in Puerto Rico and also the Latinx left over here deals with those things, so that we can be better at it, so we can be smarter at it, so that we can grow a critical mass and be more effective at just taking all of that apart.
Wow, thank you, everybody. Such an honor and a pleasure to be in company with all of you to really unpack what does it mean to to have policing in the world. And each of you already laid out like policing in so many different ways and how they take shape, whether that's through the empire or whether that's through how we police one another and criminalize one another through all of these contexts. So with that being said, we're gonna start with this question on how scholars often use 1898 and the so-called Spanish-American War as a point of departure for talking about race and American empire. Can you, and you kind of spoke to hints of this, but how can you talk about your areas of focus and of linked histories in race, policing, and US interference in the lives of folks living in other countries, and what does that look like in the specific countries that we're all sharing here, from Brazil to Puerto Rico to the Philippines and here in the States?
Kandi, do you want to pick somebody to start?
That's true, huh? Let's start. Oh yeah, let's start with you, Jose. You know, kind of going with that context of the 1898 backdrop.
So I have 10 minutes to answer that, or should I? Do you want the 2-minute version or the 10-minute version?
I know it's a long history to unpack and all in one, but, you know, just give it your best shot, you know, and I'll let you know when we want to move to, I'll let you know when we need to move to another person. But I think give it a good 3-minute range, you know?
Okay.
Okay.
So Puerto Rico, some people call it the oldest colony in the world, right? 1493 to present. It used to be a Spanish colony until 1898, and then it became part of the U.S. empire along with Guam. This is also when Hawaii was annexed through a coup after a bunch of Americans settled there. Also the Philippines, which was a U.S. colony for almost 50 years until right after World War II. Right now, there are, I mean, this is also a question about what is a colony or what counts as a colonized place in the United States, right? Obviously, there's settler colonialism and you have indigenous populations that are still dealing with that, right? And you have tribal areas like reservations that have diminished rights, etc. In addition to that, a lot of people don't know this, right? But there's also overseas colonies. The US still has overseas colonies. Sometimes we think that that's something that used to happen, you know, centuries ago or decades ago. So Puerto Rico is the most populous one, right? Right now it's 3.1 million. When I grew up there, it was actually 3.9 because so many people have left because the economy is so bad. So that's the most populous one. In addition to that, you have US Virgin Islands, you have Guam, you have American Samoa, and you have the Northern Mariana Islands. So that's important because we have to keep in mind that those places exist. The people that live in those places, they don't have representation in Congress. They can't vote for president. In the case of American Samoa, they're not even US citizens. They're not even allowed to be US citizens. Those places are way poorer than anywhere in the United States. So the poverty rate in Puerto Rico is about 50%. Nationally in the United States, I mean, I don't know what it is now after COVID, but normally it ranges around 15%, right? The poorest state, which is usually Mississippi, it's about 25% under the poverty rate. So in Puerto Rico, it's 50%. In most of these other overseas colonies, it's about the same. Similarly, in Native American reservations, most reservations hover around that range, right? And this is important because if you add all the people that live in those places that I mentioned, you already have about 5 million people, which is more than the population of half of US states. Now, this is important because we tend to think, we tend to ignore these colonial subjects, these colonized populations, because we tend to think that they're small, right? But it's not a small population, right? It's more than half of US states that live in places with diminished rights and also without the ability to have local autonomy, local control over their political and economic affairs, right? And just dealing with the consequences of colonialism, right? So that's 3 minutes, Kandi. I don't know if you want me to get more into it, but we can talk about the connection between that and policing.
No, you have a few more time.
Okay.
I'll drop in about a few more minutes, so I got another Good.
So you have to think about colonialism and racism as kind of doing this this dance, this never-ending dance. It's kind of like a yin yang, although that's not really what a yin yang is supposed to be for, but they're mutually imbricated, right? You can think of it as a two-headed monster, although it also has a third head, which is capitalism. And it's important to think of them separately, right? Because if you're an indigenous person in the United States right now, you're concerned, sure, you're concerned about racism, but you're also concerned about sovereignty and land and displacement of yourself in the land of your ancestors. But likewise, even though, so racism is part of colonialism, right? You have to have racism to have colonialism. It's really what greases the wheels of it, right? And you have to have violence too. But the other way around, racism, even if you're not dealing with a directly colonized population, borrows a lot from colonial mindsets and approaches to things, right? Because colonialism, what it did is that it created the sense that you can do certain things to some people and in some places that you're not supposed to do, right? That some people have less rights, and especially the places where they live in, those people also have less rights. You can be more harsh, et cetera, right? So when you think of colonies, think of, for example, ghettoized inner city communities, hyper-segregated by race and by class, and also the way that people are both treated by police and concentrated in terms of discrimination, housing discrimination, et cetera. But also nowadays you have these waves of gentrification. So how people are displaced, how those people are deemed to be expendable in place. That's a very colonial-like thing, right? And this is really important because now in the moment that we're in with Black Lives Matter, absolutely, right? But let's not also forget that the other demographic that suffers immensely from police violence and death are Native American youth, right? It's also extremely high. In Puerto Rico itself, it doesn't get a lot of coverage, but Puerto Rico has really high levels of police violence and impunity, basically. And in terms of incarceration and all of that, these are populations that are also disproportionately affected, right? So how can we broaden the lens when we think of disarming that police state and the violence that comes with it, right? How can we broaden our horizons so that we make sure that we tackle anti-Blackness as it is basically officialized, that's not a word, but how it's carried out officially by the state, right? But also how it intersects with colonialism, right?
Wow, thank you so much for Jose, for all of that, because that definitely gave a good entry point into how unpacking colonialism and how it, in order to do colonialism and how to do racism, it needs colonialism and vice versa, and how it occupies mindsets and bodies and land, right? And then you also mentioned a lot of things in terms of indigenous sovereignty, as well as settler colonialism, and a lot of those things we hopefully get to unpack what those means for those who might not be familiar with those terms.
Can I say one more thing, Kandi?
Sure, yes, go ahead.
So I like to think of, for example, whenever I think about Puerto Rico, I like to think of it as a limit case. And that sounds like a fancy word. What basically that means is, if this shit can happen in this place, it can happen anywhere, right? If this shit is allowed to happen in this place, it can happen anywhere. To me, like the ultimate limit case is Palestine, right? Globally, if that shit can happen there, it can happen anywhere, right? That deprivation of any kind of humanity, right? And that in the intensity of that kind of colonialism. Within the United States, if the things that happen in the overseas territories and also in the reservations and tribal areas are allowed to happen, that's the limit case for how much human life is worth, right? So that's another way to think about it in relation to the state and police violence and incarceration.
An important way to look at that, because it definitely does happen, right? So that, which brings me to Dr. Robyn Rodrigues and talking about the Philippines in the context of the same question, with these connections with Puerto Rico, and as we know, the history and the ties of the history of that, and I'll let Robyn kind of bridge those connections together. in the global context of empire, along with what's been going on in the Philippines.
Thank you, Kandi. Just to kind of bring it back to the theme for this evening, right, of global policing. What does it mean that the United States is a global police, right? Especially if we think about kind of policing as, global policing as, kind of, if we have to visualize it, right, the boot on the neck of the people of the world. Really, I think, there is something significant about 1898, particularly with respect to the US, right? And in that you see really that that's a kind of, it inaugurates the moment of the US as the global police, right? And of course, we have to think about, well, for what purpose is policing done, right? And it is important that Jose brings this issue of capitalism, because that's also what's motoring this. But I wanted to speak specifically to kind of the ways in which the question was raised, which the way I understood it was really kind of, it might help for the audience to kind of think about the ways in which race or white supremacy and global policing kind of manifest, and how they manifest in this inaugural moment in 1898 and what it looks like in the context of the Philippines. Just a couple of examples. Jose said it really well, that racism, or in another way, kind of white supremacy, greases the wheels of colonialism. In the context of the Philippines, for example, just the justifications that were made for the colonization of the Philippines. The notion of the white man's burden. Some of you may have been familiar with this term, of this idea of the white man's burden, which people might kind of popularly kind of think about that notion as somehow the burden of white people to kind of civilize the savages, the brown and black savages of the world. Well, what's really interesting and I think notable is that the term white man's burden is actually the title of a poem written by Rudyard Kipling that was specific to justifying the colonization of the Philippines. I think that's very crucial. Other ways in which kind of white supremacist kind of logics kind of undergird did US empire was even just kind of the representations of Filipinos. There are numerous books that we could probably drop information in the chat, and I'm sure there's other folks. I already see names of people who are far better or have more knowledge than I probably in these areas, but there are numerous books that kind of just look at the ways in which the Filipino bodies were represented during the moment of colonization, and the ways in which Filipinos, there was a kind of the US had a difficult time in ways, and at times borrowing from the racializations of Native peoples, at other times borrowing from kind of racializations of Black people. So the ways in which, at least at the turn of the century, the Filipino was kind of figured in the American imagination, and the justification again for the colonization of the Philippines, really kind of rooted in these white supremacist logics. Just in terms of what actually happened, the Philippines had a very short-lived kind of moment of freedom, like the Puerto Rico, also colonized by the Philippines, had been waging revolution against, or colonized by the Spanish. It had been raging kind of revolution against the Spanish, and it's at the moment of kind of Philippine independence that the U.S. comes first promising to actually be an ally, a kind of convincing Filipino revolutionaries that it could actually serve as an ally because of the U.S.'s purported kind of anti-colonial history, against the British, and then of course quickly turning around and becoming colonizers themselves. Lots of things, just again about the Philippine-American War that then ensued. Because Filipinos, if they had already raised arms against the Spanish, then raised arms in resistance to the Americans, and the United States, many of the people who, the very soldiers who were participating in the dispossession and genocide of Native peoples here, many of these veterans were the same veterans who went to the Philippines. Torture techniques that have since been used by the U.S. on many other peoples around the world, like the water torture that gained a lot of attention during the War on Terror. which of course is still ongoing, but really kind of at the height of it in the early 2000s, invented against Filipino revolutionaries. Again, there's so many other kind of examples, but again, I think, the Philippines is also a very interesting site. Particularly when you're looking at kind of, Jose talks about the millions of people who continue to be under the yoke of the United States as a colony. And what does it look like in the context of the Philippines when you have over 100 million people under the yoke of the US, but as a neo-colony? And this is where it becomes really incredibly complicated when you have Filipinos who really are doing the work of policing other Filipinos for the purposes of ensuring US interests are preserved, because their own interests have been tied very closely to US interest. And that's very clear in this context too, with under the Duterte administration. Just even the fact that what we're seeing is just this thousands, tens of thousands of Filipinos are being killed by the Duterte regime. There is a reason for, that it's a drug war that was, if it launched, this should be familiar with US audiences. These kinds of technologies that were used in the US ultimately as a means of controlling poor people, right? As a means of containing, we could go on kind of just about understanding why the war on drugs was launched when it was. Because you could really see Nixon was kind of where the, was initially launched a war on drugs. Reagan launches it later in the US. Let's not forget both, this is happening at the time also when people of color, Black people, were rising up, right? In movements so much akin to today. And they were met with these kinds of interventions in the form of the war on drugs, which was really kind of less about drugs and more on a war of on the people. So, I just kind of wanted to make those kinds of connections for those unfamiliar, because one of the things we've struggled with, frankly, as those of us who've been trying to do this work of really raising kind of this awareness of the ways in which US imperialism has worked in the Philippines, is how even among so-called progressives or self-identified progressives, frankly, the Philippines falls out. And I think that's precisely the work of what imperialism can do, and what happens when neocolonialism and empire can disappear. Even in the Puerto Rican case, I thank you, Jose, for reminding us that this is a country that has colonized millions of people that are still colonial subjects. There is a way that, and why global policing as a framework becomes so important is because this is how we render visible the kinds of violences that have slipped, from our view, and that we need to center in our view, because truly, if we understand the ways in which policing is working against Black bodies, but also the ways in which it's insinuating itself and sort of with so many other bodies, we'll never be able to really get rid of this problem, right? Which is a very, very deep rooted problem. And so it does require of us, white supremacy is highly organized. Empire is highly organized. So we need to be too. And we need that quality of mind, that critical analysis to weave these understandings together if we're really going to go after the problem of our times.
Dr. Robyn Rodrigues, for really kind of bringing this historical context of the Philippines and the racialization of the people of the Philippines, as well as that how America had this imagination of under justification of the Philippines and the Filipino people, and then making those connections to Duterte, to policing, and how these connections here with the policing in the States, which actually brings me to you, Dr. Stuart Schrader, kind of bringing in this range of, with your work in your book of badge, as well as how your understandings of policing and the counterinsurgents of that. So maybe making those connections from here, since we're now arriving to this place, and then we can then work our way back with Jessica to kind of give another entire framing of Black politics in Brazil and so on. So I'll leave it to you, Stuart, to kind of rein in on these connections that Robyn landed on.
Yeah, thanks so much. This is really fantastic. And maybe I can go from, in some ways, go from the Philippines to Brazil in what I'm about to say. So, just to pick up on two threads, from Dr. Rodrigues and Dr. Fuste, the United States at the end of World War II, granted independence to the Philippines. Of course, there had been a really long struggle for independence in the Philippines. And part of the policing apparatus that the United States built in the Philippines was to prevent and control the independence movement. And when World War II ended, of course, the United States was victorious, and the Nazis had been defeated, the fascists in Italy had been defeated, the Japanese Empire had been defeated, and the United States kind of looked around the world and said, well, we don't think that the way we are going to become the leaders of the globe and the leaders of capitalism on a global scale is if we replicate some of the traditions of these, defeated powers. Now, there were empires, European empires. France had an empire, Britain had an empire, and those were allies of the United States, but they were weakened, of course, by the war. The United States was strengthened in the course of the war. So the United States makes the decision, high-powered elites in the White House and the State Department, they make the decision, and of course this is a complicated history, so I'm simplifying a bit, but they make the decision that they're going to, grant independence to the Philippines, and they're going to start working with other countries that are now becoming independent through their own decolonization struggles, and they're going to try to make allies out of them. What do they do when they make allies out of independent countries, whether it's now the Philippines, which has just gained independence, or 10 years later, Vietnam, which gains independence from France? What do they do? Well, the first thing, or one of the first things they do, is they send in some police experts from the United States, the people who write the textbooks that police study when they go to police school, the people who are leading chiefs who kind of write journal articles for other cops, and get awards from the president or from the governor. They send these types of police experts and leaders to these other countries around the globe, and they say, well, we are going to help you build up your own police forces. And so just as Dr. Rodrigues said, in the Philippines, of course, the people who are doing the policing, who are doing the, operating the drug war up to the present, these are people who are born in the Philippines. They are native Filipinos who are equipped and trained by the United States, and have been, particularly in the Philippines, for decades upon decades. But they look like the people that they're policing, right? And in the United States, I would argue that this experience of, in these neo-colonies, these countries around the globe that the United States is developing this new type of relationship with, beginning during the Cold War, the idea of using the local police who look like the people who are to be policed, becomes an inspiration for police when they come back to the United States. And of course, in the current moment of political upheaval around policing in the United States, one thing we've heard, and this is not, of course, new, but one thing we've heard is, well, if only the police officers who were doing the policing in Baltimore, in San Diego, you name it, if only they came from the community, if only they looked like the people who are being policed, well, then maybe the outcomes would be more just. Now, that may be true, it's possible, but I think we can look at this history that we're talking about of neocolonialism around the globe and the way that the United States has enlisted people from these countries, from the Philippines to Brazil, to Thailand, to Vietnam, and many other places across sub-Saharan Africa. we can look at these places and see that there are profoundly unjust outcomes. Capitalism is operating in full force. Colonialism is operating in full force, and they're operating with police who look like the people that are being policed. And so that, I think, allows us to think differently about what the purpose and function of police, and less about the kind of independent mentality of the police officers themselves, who they may have the best interests of their neighbors and their communities at heart, but ultimately they're there for a very specific purpose that I think we're talking about right now. And the history of U.S. empire, I think, is really clarifying as we try to think through some of these issues. And it certainly is the case that when the United States gives police assistance and training to other countries, it's always the case that the existing racial inequalities in those countries, in a place like Brazil, in an existing colony like Puerto Rico, those existing inequalities, even before the United States is there, they get worse, right? So it forces us to reckon with how intractable some of these problems are, and how thorough we need to think about what kind of transformations are necessary. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much for that, Stuart. I think it's really important, like this friendliness almost that they kind of acquired for themselves to be able to rein people in to do their work on their agenda. And I think that brings us back, brings us towards Jessica, Dr. Jessica Graham, for really breaking down Blackness and Black politics and what is happening in Brazil. So I'm gonna bring it over towards you and kind of connecting these pieces here again on that global context of Brazil and what's happening there.
Great, thank you. You've all given me a lot of food for thought here. I think as a historian, what I'll do is kind of take us, through a historical trajectory about policing in Brazil and in the 5 minutes that I have. So it's going to be very short, but I will, start to talk about where I think the U.S. Starts to have a huge role and influence beginning in the 1930s. So similar to the ways in which we talk about policing in the United States in terms of the roots of policing as, slave patrols, that is a similar history that occurs in Brazil, where slavery was the huge public security problem in Brazil until the end of the Brazilian Empire, which was in 1889. And actually, Brazil has a number of different police forces. The civil police are mostly responsible for detective work, things of that nature. The military police are the ones who are sort of the boots on the ground doing the active physical policing of bodies. And the military police in Brazil have roots that also date back to colonial times. Just very quickly, in the early 19th century, the Portuguese royal family was fleeing Napoleon during the Napoleonic Wars, and they fled to the colony of Brazil. And so you had essentially the king, or actually at the time he was the Prince Regent of Brazil, and 10,000 people, 10,000 members of the royal court had relocated to the colony. So Brazil basically became the epicenter of the Portuguese Empire, which was obviously very powerful at the beginning of the 19th century. Now, what's happening simultaneously at this time, and this is an event that I always say I think is one of the most understudied in terms of its impact globally, especially in the Americas, was the Haitian Revolution, right? This is happening right after the end of the Haitian Revolution. And as one Brazilian historian, Luis Simas, has referred to it as there was a severe case of Haitianism in Brazil. And this was the case around the world, right? Especially in populations where the elite were looking around and realizing that they were outnumbered. And if there were to be a similar revolt of the enslaved in those societies, they would clearly be outnumbered, and there would potentially be another successful overthrow of that colonial power and the declaration of independence by the enslaved. So this had huge reverberations. Like I said, I think that we don't really appreciate the impact of that And so you have this concern about this enslaved population. The royal family is in Brazil. And this is when the military police is basically born in 1809. So the idea of suppressing Blacks while protecting the property of the small group of elite was basically the mission of the military police in Brazil. So those roots are very important to understand. And obviously when you get into later into the 19th century, where you have ideals of scientific racism, the criminalization of Black, particularly Black men, this idea that it's, the terms we would use today are biological and genetic, that it's inherent and innate in who they are as human beings, that they create a risk for the rest of Brazilian society, is all happening, while these police forces are being constructed. So this is this historical and racist foundation of the police in Brazil. Now, when we get to the 1930s, during the period that I study, another thing I think is also very understudied is the impact of anti-communism in terms of anti-Blackness globally. I think there was an anti-Black network that was created among different authorities, South Africa, United States, Brazil, many places around the world, that basically targeted people who fought against racism, who spoke about egalitarian notions in a very radical way. Those folks were targeted as being communists, and they were suppressed. And as we all know, very violently so in multiple societies. So this has roots and is born in the 1930s, and anti-communism and its connection to racism, or the struggles against racism is an aspect of my own research. And it's something that, as Stuart was saying, in terms of, the connections that the United States had with other countries in the world, this was anti-communism was a theme that really began to bring in the military attachés who were present in Brazil in the 1930s. And they tried to understand the racial milieu of Brazil and also the political milieu and how things like that were connected. So those roots, those anti-communist roots and those connections between the United States and Brazil begin in the 1930s and obviously explode when Brazil becomes a military dictatorship in 1964. And so you have the roots of that anti-communism really develop. The United States was very much involved in Brazil's military coup in 1964. There was a so-called Operation Brother Sam, in which the United States was sending, destroyers and weapons and tanks to Brazil once they understood that they were going to move to overthrow Goulart, who was perceived to be a communist. And so with the knowledge that the United States was sending literally military help, the Brazilian military was able to overthrow the regime. And I should say that the doctrine of national security, which buttressed, was the ideological buttressing of the military dictatorship, was an ideology that the United States helped to construct. The CIA financed a think tank, which translates into the Brazilian Institute of Democratic Action. French and US military advisors were also very active in helping to formulate this idea, which defended and justified the military dictatorship by saying we're protecting the country against communism. And again, when you have a country in which nationalism is based on the idea of the lack of discrimination, that means for Black folks who are mobilizing around these issues, even if they're not articulating them in explicitly racial terms, if they're challenging the state based upon economic inequality, if they're challenging capitalism, if they're challenging this notion that the military regime is actually bringing about the best society that looks out for the needs of all of its citizens, when you're challenging that, you are perceived as a threat. So you have another class of, as I mentioned before, in the 1930s, the first kind of big group of political prisoners. In the 30s now, you see the emergence of that on a larger level. You see people who are exiled. But as Benedita da Silva, the first Black female senator in Brazil, would say during that time period, the poor Blacks were exiled in their own country. People were, favelas, the so-called favela communities were completely razed. Often people who were determined to be just community activists had to flee and find, refuge in a different part of the country. Families were separated. The kind of economic struggle became amplified. So there's so much I could say. I don't know how much more time I have, but I'm really kind of interested in the Stuart's idea, and also how DJ Kandi pointed out this idea of using friendliness to do its work. I'll just say that I think I think it'd be really interesting to analyze the role of the good neighbor policy in terms of creating these kind of friendly relations between the United States and Latin America, and how those friendly relationships, if you analyze over time, really turned into the kind of neo-colonial relationships that existed. So I'll stop there.
Can I just maybe ask a question? We have like, we did a little script of questions. So, we'll get into those, but hearing everyone talk, I guess I wanted to ask this question, which is, we see all this military hardware on display in the United States in protests in this particular moment. From what I hear, oftentimes we talk about that in regard to the US Army, and the US Army specifically donating this stuff to these local departments. But hearing all of you speak, it seems to me like maybe part of the conversation about the militarization of policing needs to happen at the level of talking about policing abroad. And so I guess would like to hear a little bit maybe about, at least especially for the folks who are on, in our audience and on the call, what do the police look like in the Philippines or Puerto Rico and Brazil? I mean, do you see the kind of cancerous metastasization, is that how you say that word? Where it's very difficult to distinguish between whether someone is a policeman and a soldier, or is that something that maybe is not as present in those places? Just curious again about how we think about the police as opposed to the army, and what role that plays in the conversation.
I guess just real quick, I mean, it's not even just that you can't distinguish the police from the military. And then now, there's also just vigilantism. So the police, the military, and sort of vigilantes, just to kind of quickly answer that question. And in the Philippine case, we're approaching nearly 30,000 people who've been killed in this drug war. And it's been a range of types of actors, just as I suggest. And so, and I can drop into the chat just a couple of references for folks so that we have some time for other responses as well as other questions.
Can I take a quick shot at that? When I grew up in the 1990s in Puerto Rico, take San Juan, which is where like half of the population lives, right? Race and space are kind of different from the United States. It's less noticeably segregated. It's more kind of like mosaic. It's not like you have like this side of the city is this people and that side of the city. And as a matter of fact, there was like a progressive governor that thought that if you actively desegregated neighborhoods, the good customs, right, of the middle class would rub off on the poor, right? When I grew up in Puerto Rico, I grew up in a middle-class neighborhood near a public housing project and behind a Section 8 building. And it was war. There was an open declaration of war against working class poor neighborhoods. The National Guard was activated, right? So reservists were activated. So like, for example, one of my good friends, his dad, who was not even Puerto Rican, he was Chilean. He was like this really nerdy guy, office guy, and all of a sudden he's walking around with a uniform and a machine gun. And he had to post up in a public housing project. And they built walls all around the public housing projects, and they built checkpoints, but the checkpoints were there to keep people both out and in, In Puerto Rico, they tend to think of themselves as places where those things don't happen. That happens in the Dominican Republic, or that happens in Cuba, but it's not that different, right? Because again, it's a limit case. And that's the relationship that people have had with the police since the beginning of American colonialism and from Spanish colonialism too. the last decades of Spanish colonialism were extremely violent. And in many ways, the early insular police, which was the name that the police took after the US occupied, in many cases, they were the same people, right? The same captains, the same commanders, right? So there's been that cat and mouse game with the police, right? And like you said, they're also enlisting locals, right? And it's just a really, yeah, it's a really violent affair.
Jessica or Stuart, I don't know if you want to, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I'll just very quickly just say that, as I said, in Brazil, it is actually the military police that is responsible for doing the policing in the country. So there is already considered to have that connection to the military. And also pointing back to something Stuart said earlier about conversations of, you know, the benefits of having police come from particular communities. I believe the majority of the military police in Brazil are people of color, who are, you know, basically, as Black activists would say, are the agents of this major and massive Black genocide that is occurring in Brazil at the hands of state violence.
Stuart, I don't know if you want to touch on that or, okay. So one of the things that we wanted to, I guess, also ask people is, obviously we're living in a moment where there's quite a bit of activity, thankfully and wonderfully to see on the streets. People are moving. And I'm just curious the extent to which the mobilizing and the activism we see in the United States may or may not be resonating in the places that you study or know, what you see as being contributions that struggles inside the United States might make, and where perhaps even you see that there are some like things that get lost in translation or things that don't work. I know it's a complicated question. So, you know, we won't hold everybody permanently forever and ever to their answers, but I do want to give a little sense for our audience of what you see, how you see maybe the back and forth, I guess, from here to there and so forth. Us again, anybody can.
Okay, yeah, I guess I could try to speak to some of that. I mean, definitely, I think, you know, I mean, first off, I think it's important to understand that so many of the targets of the current President Rodrigo Duterte in the Philippines, the current targets really of his so-called drug war, of course, are poor people, but ultimately those who are those who dissent, right? Those who have been organizing for many decades against this kind of neo-colonial oligarchical elite, and so many of those people who are in kind of these movements in the Philippines have been doing work for many, many decades in trying to build relationships with kind of progressive organizations, anti-imperialist organizations in the United States. I think it's not easy work to do. I think the cross-border labor solidarity in a meaningful way. I mean, I think there's lots of stuff that can happen on social media, but there's something else that happens when you're kind of engaging in space and time around and in coordination around kind of shared campaigns, for instance. And I know that in the past, there have been kind of different sorts of mobilizations. Because again, you know, this moment is not just this moment, right? This is a moment that for many of us is not just now. The fight around, you know, kind of policing and kind of white supremacist violence has been going on for many, many years. So I guess I'm saying, I think that there has been lots of different sorts of exchanges. Some of it has been literally cross-border of people trying to share. Oftentimes the people doing the sharing are biracial, multiracial Filipinx and Black folks who are also been drawn into kind of radical movements connected in the Philippines and have done the actual traveling. I even count my own child who who is in the Philippines right now, who is mixed race, Black and Filipinx, who has literally participated in these exchanges. And some of the, you know, I think part of it is a lot, on one hand, in the Philippines, it's been hard to really, really grapple with understanding how white supremacy and anti-Blackness operates in the Philippines, even amongst those who are progressive, really grappling with the fact that empire, imperialism, US colonialism in the Philippines was deeply racialized. It's not quite in the same way in the language there, I think, among progressives, though I think that's also changing, which is also good. Meanwhile, I think there's still this work, but I think this is an example, just this forum is an example too, of the ways in which many of us who've been doing this work have been trying to always, provide these lines of connection across time and space, because we need to do this work in this way. I worry, I've said this many times, and for some who might have heard me say this again, what I worry about, I think folks, especially when social media might be your primary mode of political engagement, is history is as much as you can scroll through a feed. And that worries me, because I think that that's when we lose sight of kind of what our targets ought to be when we're talking about this work of really rooting out, white supremacy.
Thanks for that, Robyn. And the need to root things out and these, the ways in which we got to look at these lines of connections, which kind of also brings me back to this question of, because I can't help but keep thinking back to what Jose was saying about if it could happen here, it could happen anywhere. So in this moment, and I direct this question towards you, Stuart, is like this present moment could be one of rising resistance to state violence. And so in that, why is the global context of policing so important? Because I think we can see all these, not even hints, like direct things happening here and escalating with the, and Danny mentioned the riot gear, right? So all of these things, like what are these, why is now, especially more than ever, to the discussion of a global context of policing so important?
Yeah, thanks. That's a really good question. I mean, I think one thing that we've already kind of put on the table is this convergence in the way that police are operating and the types of gear that they're using, their tactics. The companies that are supplying arms to police, they're multinational companies. It's like, in some ways, as much as I love to be critical of the United States, some of these companies are, they're bigger than the United States in some sense. Brazil, for example, is exporting tear gas all over the world. The reason that Brazil makes so much tear gas is because some of the folks that I study in my research went to Brazil in the 1960s and said, hey, tear gas is a great weapon. You should try it out. And the Brazilian, military police said, you're right, this is great, but we don't want to buy it from you. We want to make it ourselves and build up our own domestic economy. So you see these kind of catalytic linkages between, U.S. firms and the global economy, the kind of security commodity economy. And it's massive, it's huge, the tentacles reach all over the place, and they cross borders, they crisscross borders. In Baltimore right now, I talk about this all the time. In Baltimore right now, there's a surveillance plane that is constantly flying over the city at a very low altitude. You can hear it every single day. I hear it every single day. This surveillance plane is using technology that was developed for the war in Iraq. And we think, we don't really know all the details, but we think that it's basically being tested on Baltimore, on a city that is deeply racially segregated, and a majority Black city. We think it's being tested, and it may be, redeployed to Iraq or to Afghanistan in the future. So some of our ideas that, I think are common among many scholars, that technologies gets tested in the colonial laboratory and then deployed at home. Well, actually here, it might even be the reverse, where it's being tested at home and will be redeployed to the colonial laboratory. So all of these these really complicated webs and networks, you know, they exceed our grasp and our understanding just because they're so vast, and no individual can really make sense of all of them. So I think that just kind of points to the need to work collectively and work together and really think together and bring our expertise from our different parts of the globe into conversation so that we can really create a map of how all of this is working.
Thank you.
Yeah, sorry. Actually, I was gonna, I had some remarks to Danny's question earlier about the impact of Black Lives Matter internationally. And I kind of wanted to echo a little bit of what Robyn said in terms of the Philippines. Interestingly, by the way, the New York Times said that the Bolsonaro regime's anti-crime campaign, if you will, very much resembles what's happening in the Philippines. So you see these connections being made. Bolsonaro often looks at, you know, what Donald Trump does in terms of his, for instance, his dismissal of COVID. We see kind of these international connections, and the parallel of the rhetoric around many of these issues, I think, is one of the things that makes it reverberate. You know, people recognize what's happening in another country, and they interpret it in terms of what's happening locally. So it's not that, as I've seen it, the protests that we've seen around the world have been against, you know, what happened, for instance, to George Floyd, but also people are looking at the cases and the manifestation of anti-Blackness in their own societies, or whatever the racialized group is at the bottom of the racial hierarchy. They are identifying with what happened with this sort of the ways in which white supremacy rules the state security apparatus. But one thing I do want to say in particular, I can, you know, maybe later give some statistics about Brazil, but it has become the country, I believe, with the most murders in the world. And since the election of Bolsonaro, whose campaign was very much an anti-crime campaign, he was a self-described, you know, guy who was going to be, you know, bring about the end of what Brazilians refer to as sort of violencia, you know, the violence that occurs based on the high crime rate. So that was largely what he ran on, what he won on, and he has fulfilled those promises in many ways. And where you see the number of crimes diminishing in places like Rio, you see a huge catapult in the number of police killings, police extrajudicial killings. In Rio, for instance, I believe about a quarter of all police killings happened in Rio, and 2019 was the record. It was over 1,800 people actually nationally were killed. No, I'm sorry, 1,800 people killed just in Rio alone, which was a huge increase from the year prior. So these are, you know, realities that folks and communities are living with. And I do feel the need to say that there is often a resistance and even an anger around this notion that Brazilians are protesting because people in the United States are. Just like Robyn said, these movements have been occurring for decades, you know, since slavery. And so there was a webinar that I watched recently, a Haymarket webinar with Preta Ferreira, who's a Black feminist activist and who organizes around housing issues, but, you know, was also asked questions about policing. And she said, we need to legitimize the movement here in Brazil, because there's often this tendency to believe that there are no indigenous heroes in Brazil, that there are no Black heroes in Brazil. We don't learn about them. We're silenced and we're rendered invisible. But we are here. She's like, I wouldn't be here if it hadn't been for the Black and indigenous protesters and activists before me, those who work with me contemporarily and those who exist in the future. So I would be very careful not to assume that, you know, people are just suddenly out of the blue organizing around these issues because of what's happening in the United States. There have been long historical roots of this kind of activism in many countries.
Right. No, thank you for that, Dr. Jessica, because I think that really brings it to Robyn, because I think something that from the framing from the beginning of this was talking about indigenous communities and how they're impacted in all the countries. And I think in the Philippines, you know, with indigenous communities from the very beginning of the colonial project, empire building, the indigenous communities were most definitely impacted. So we bring that to today. How is it happening now with Duterte and the impact of the policing on the Filipino people who have been uprising since long before People Power 1, People Power 2, dating back again to the Spanish-American War, and then coming here to now?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the indigenous peoples of the Philippines were the first in the kind of Duterte's targets of violence. And, you know, let's be clear, it's because they have engaged in armed resistance, you know, against encroachment by mining companies, you know, fighting for sovereignty, you know, really being able to kind of truly, genuinely exercise their democratic rights. I mean, so absolutely, you know, indigenous peoples in the Philippines have been at the front lines of the anti-colonial struggle, and that is a through line, and they continue to be engaged in armed struggle, and have gained, you know, many, and have been successful. And again, part of the violence of the Philippine state is because indigenous peoples have been, you know, successful in some instances at really kind of staving off multinational corporations and being able to build autonomous institutions to preserve their cultures, you know, to really kind of exist and build, you know, an alternative to, you know, the kind of neoliberal program that that is really being aggressively touted by, you know, every successive Philippine administration. So yeah, there's very much a connection between kind of this violence on the part of the state and centuries-long indigenous struggles in the Philippines.
Thank you very, very much, Robyn and Jessica both. And I wanted to just ask Jose to follow up. I saw you nodding a bit when we were talking, both when the question first came about the resonance of struggles in the US, and then again when Jessica was pointing out the discomfort that potentially that framing can create for people who are struggling in Brazil, right? And the risk of their resistance getting cast as foreign or imported or inauthentic. So the kind of, I guess, any way you want to approach it or the angle of that is good.
I've been amening everything that people have been saying, but this is a great panel. Yeah, I mean, I see the connections here everywhere. You know, one of the things that really radicalized me when I was younger was reading Frantz Fanon. And I was introduced to Fanon because he was a fellow Caribbean writer. But Fanon was writing, of course, about colonialism and racism in the Caribbean, but also in Africa, in North Africa specifically. And, you know, this idea of how the colonized will always believe the worst about themselves, right? This idea that colonialism leaves behind a rot that needs to be cleansed of the land, but in our minds, right? And how the violence of colonialism creates these cycles of violence, right? You know, I'm from San Juan, and San Juan is one of the cities with one of the highest murder rates per capita in Latin America. And that's been like that forever. Like as long as I can remember, it's like 2 or 3 murders every day. In addition to the police violence. So it's very much a cycle of violence. Because of that, you know, when Black Lives Matter started, what was it, like 4 or 5 years ago, you know, I was paying close attention to whether that was gonna resonate in Puerto Rico, whether there was gonna be a local version of that in any way. And originally it didn't happen. Now, after these latest, you know, murders of civilians of color, including George Floyd, there were for the first time visible Black Lives Matter protests, but they were in Loíza, which is, it's kind of different because Loíza in some ways, it identifies itself as a maroon community, right? And this happens throughout Latin America, where you have indigenous communities that are removed from urban centers that disidentify with the state and identify as historically aggrieved populations by the state. But you also have Black communities that disidentify with the state, right? remember that the first Maroons meaning people fleeing plantation slavery and getting off the radar, the first Maroons were Tainos. The word is actually a Taino word. It means a stray arrow, right? So it's no surprise that Loíza in the census identifies as like 85% Black, whereas the rest of Puerto Rico identifies as 85% white, right? So it's no surprise that there are Black Lives Matter manifestations in Loíza, and there are some allies from outside that partook in that. But island-wide, people are not there because they feel like they're being squeezed between a violent underground economy, which doesn't leave any kind of ability for people to resolve disputes outside of violence, right? It's inherent to it. An underground economy is inherently violent. And the violent state, right? And you know, the police come from poor communities, the communities that are affected by violence themselves. So people, it's very hard for people to identify, including people from historically oppressed, you know, poor barrios and public housing projects. I think it's very hard for them to identify with Black Lives Matter. It's also an issue of how race works differently in Puerto Rico, and it's much more gradated. I mean, there's anti-Blackness, but there's gradated anti-Blackness, and there's colorism, and there is, you know, aspirational whiteness, and people obsessed with aspirational whiteness and aspirational Americanness. And I hope that we're reaching a pivotal moment. You know, last summer with all the protests against the governor, there was a lot of police violence that caught a lot of media attention. And there was a little bit of pushback there, and there's always been like the ACLU, you know, they do work on this. And so there's a small contingent of people that work on, you know, denouncing police abuse. Also, the prison industrial complex works differently because Puerto Rico is so broke that they don't have money to put that many people in prison. So, which also increases the violence because that's also how punishment is meted out, you know. I remember when I was a kid and marijuana was hyper criminalized, you know, most of this never happened to me, but most of my friends who would go, you know, score a dime bag and they would got caught by police, they weren't arrested, they were beat up. You know, that was the punishment that was meted out to you. You were either beat up by police or you were taken to a neighborhood where there was another kid that was arrested for something else, and they were told, okay, beat this guy up, you know. Because they don't have money to spend $20,000, $30,000 a year to put somebody behind bars. The government is so broke. So that also drives the police violence in a way, you know.
That might have been something that got exported from US police agencies because they did a lot of that shit in Los Angeles too.
Yeah. But ironically, even though so many people are victimized by police violence, you know, people haven't turned against modern policing in the way that perhaps in some communities of color they have here, because they feel like on the other side you have, you know, the violent underground economy that people are also directly affected by. And there's very little awareness of how this is just one cycle that feeds, you know, there's different sides of the cycle that feed each other. There's a feedback loop, right? And there has to be a way of interrupting that feedback loop. And that partly comes from, you know, abolishing modern police and the prison industrial complex. It also must come from getting rid of guns. And in Puerto Rico, even though Puerto Rico as a jurisdiction has the strictest gun control laws in all of territorial United States, there is a huge market for guns because of the underground economy. And it's relatively easy for people to acquire them. You know, you can literally FedEx an AK-47 from a bought in a gun show and FedEx it to Puerto Rico, and FedEx doesn't check that stuff, right? And it's just a matter of, there's many people that know how to retrofit it to make it fully automatic, or even to just make a semi-automatic pistol fully automatic. There's a lot of gun violence in Puerto Rico, and they're all made in the US, just like in anywhere else in Latin America. You go to Caracas, which is the most violent city in Latin America, those guns don't come from Russia, you know? They don't come from France. 100% of them come from the United States, right? Mm. So, that's another issue that cuts across. I'm assuming, Jessica, that in cities like Rio, you know, where there is a lot of violence, a lot of those guns are coming from the U.S. too. You know.
Well, I think those are good questions to ask and dig deeper into. I also want to be mindful of the questions coming in from the audience. We have two questions. I'm going to go with Lawana's question, which is, what role can education reform, or decolonization of education systems play in police reform and community self-sufficiency? Interesting question, as we also tackle that along with the conversations of moving towards really some abolitionist lens too. So I kind of want to, if anyone wants to pick that up, since we're all educators here, and how this works into the context of how we can do this within, as educators that you all are. I mean, it could be anybody. Anyone want to pick it up? Don't you know?
Yeah, I think there are a number of Black activist groups in Brazil that deal specifically with education. UNEAFRO in São Paulo is one of them. In fact, Douglas Belchior, who's one of the leaders of that movement, was here in San Diego in February, giving a talk at San Diego State. And I think that there is a realization that the public education system in Brazil is just horrible. And you know, there was a time during Lula's administration where a law was passed that the schools were forced to actually teach Black history, or in particular the history of Black resistance in Brazil, because that had been completely excluded from the curriculum. And again, this is a country, as I said, that has more Black people than any place in the world outside of Nigeria, and Black people were just absent. You learn about Zumbi, who was, you know, leader of a big Maroon society, going back to what Jose said. I believe the largest Maroon society in the Americas existed for 100 years. I mean, really, there are only a couple of people that, you know, folks would learn about. So just having that, the ability to understand not just sort of the role and the contribution of Blacks in Brazil, but the history of resistance, understanding all of these themes that we've been talking about today, how white supremacy works, how neoliberalism creates these inequality in society, that creates a class of folks that are racialized to be permanently existing in the sort of economic sphere, if you will. I think that all of these kind of forms of education, and Black activists realize, are really critical in order for people to be able to accurately kind of evaluate and analyze what's happening in Brazil. And we saw with the election of Bolsonaro that there was a significant number of people of color who voted for him, partly because, as I said, he sold himself as the anti-crime guy, and the people who are the most victimized by crime in Brazil are people of color. So it was a rhetoric that really resonated with them. But there's obviously kind of a disconnect between someone who has very anti-Black policies in every way possible, and someone who's claiming that they're going to bring about, you know, the end of crime or violence in Brazil. So that is really points to the need for education for people, again, to kind of understand the history of these forms of inequality, to understand how they operate and function in today's world, and to be able to then be sort of more proactive citizens in terms of bringing about and eradicating these forms of inequality, understanding what the targets should be, the folks that they should be aligning with, and not actually having the skepticism that many Blacks in Brazil have, to be honest, of Black activists. Again, if you're in a country where, you know, you're not supposed to be talking about racism, there is also often suspicious, even among Black folks, of Blacks who are talking about racism in very radical ways, right? At least in the Brazilian context. So the understanding, the education that the children would need to have in order to be able to mobilize to appropriately deal with these forms of inequality would be, and again, as I said, and is recognized by many Black activists as being really fundamental, and should be a primary goal and objective of any movement.
Can I take a quick shot at that?
Yes.
Similarly, the public education system in Puerto Rico is irredeemable. And I mean, it was from the very beginning of American colonialism, which is really when the public education system started, because the Spaniards didn't even have a public education system. It was used as an instrument of social control. It always has been. It is like in the United States, when people talk about school to prison pipelines, I mean, the public schools in Puerto Rico function like correctional institutions almost, you know? And this is really frustrating because, you know, I'm not a full-fledged anarchist because I believe that the state should have a role in helping people's lives. You know, it's like, imagine that you have a mountain of sand that you have to carry from one side of the valley to the other. You can either do it with buckets or you can bring a machine, you know, a bulldozer that does it. The state is the bulldozer, you know? But sadly, I don't think that the state is gonna get us there. We're gonna have to really build, you know, a human chain of bucket carriers to move a substantial amount of sand in the right direction before the state catches on. Because you have to educate the public for the public to elect the right kind of government, right? And the public education system is designed to prevent that, to protect the current dysfunctional government, right? So one of the things that has come out of the hurricane and the earthquakes this year is people have become increasingly reliant on community organizations, you know, that are doing all kinds of things with food justice, environmental justice, you know, renewable energy, etc. And I think those are the schools, that is the education that is going to change things. And it's super difficult because there's very little money for it and people are doing it as a side thing because people got to figure out how to, you know, pay the bills and buy food at the same time. So we are like carrying, you know, sand across the other side of the valley with our hands or with buckets, you know, but we're going to have to do it. And call me cynical, but, you know, the education system, even the university, which is relatively radical compared to the public education system, that is being taken down. The radical University of Puerto Rico is being taken down because the government knows that it has to get rid of it. They want to privatize it now, you know, because they want to dull any kind of critical thinking and resistance in official education systems.
I'm looking at the time. Anybody else? And then we could, maybe Danny may be closing to like wrap up questions too, right? I don't know if there you go, Danny.
Yeah, I'm here.
Yeah. Those are all good points in talking about, I mean, it's such a colonial project you're talking about with colonization and all of the work that it needs to do with, I hear you with the buckets, you know, and that's why I think even bringing the context that we were talking about, how the rhetoric that you were bringing in that was being used in Brazil, and I think about that in the Philippines, the rhetoric with the war on drugs, right, and then bringing that the colonization of that in order to happen, and the decolonization that needs to happen. It's a lot of water buckets to do. I'm gonna leave to Danny because I know we're short on time. So Danny, maybe we like the wrap up question we might want to unpack.
Well, I don't know. I'm going to pass it over to Khalid to decide whether we have time for a 30-second round on the final question, or if we should adhere to our Malcolm X inspired discipline about the time at which we end.
So you know what? Because I've had my wife send me a question to ask, I'm going to have to back away from the Malcolm X thing, but I'm sure Malcolm X would be in favor of me trying to preserve my marriage. But there was a question about, I'm looking for it now. Maybe somebody else can bring it.
The question, oh, where did it go? It was here. Did it go somewhere?
It's for Dr. Graham. So my wife is from.
Okay, I sent, what happened in part was I typed an answer and that caused it to disappear. So Jessica, we got a question. I think this is well, I'll just ask it. We got a question about Marielle Franco.
I'm going to interrupt real quick one more time. I'm a horrible person. Robyn has to leave because she had a strong cutoff at 7:30. Robyn, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate
Thank you so much. And again, I invite everybody, maybe Kandi share our, the University for Justice and Liberation if folks want to keep doing this work. My quick answer, 30 seconds. I guess for me, this is the kind of education we need. And it's less about prison reform and more towards working towards liberation, really, because that's where we need to get. Prison reform is not the answer, at least in my book. And I think that, you know, that's an invitation, if folks are still working that through and not quite there yet, an invitation to kind of engage with other folks to get to a place where we might think about education towards different kinds of ends. So that's it. But thank y'all so much. I learned so much from everybody. It was good to meet everyone here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, nice to meet you.
And now back to preserving my marriage. Danny, I'll hand the question off to you.
Well, I believe the question was about Maria Franco and her murder. I would imagine that some of the folks on our call won't know who she was, her presence and role in Brazil. So maybe Jessica, if you would just give us a brief introduction about her case and why that is a kind of a clarion call for the kinds of struggles that we're talking about.
Sure. Marielle Franco was had been an elected official in the city of Rio. She was the product of, going back to the question of education, of some sort of community activist educational initiatives in the area that she lived in Rio. Had gone to, I believe it was the Catholic University of Rio, which is a well-established and respected university, because of these initiatives, and was eventually elected, as I said, to as a local politician in Rio. She was attending an event that spoke. I have actually seen some footage of the event, and they were speaking about Black feminism and many other issues. And as she was leaving the event, a couple of motorcycles pulled up to her car and shot and murdered her, as well as her driver. And so many of you probably heard about it because there was an international outcry. People who never paid attention to Brazil before were suddenly saying, who killed Marielle presente. And basically, in terms of what's happening with the case now, I'll be totally honest, it's hard for me to even wrap my brain around it because it's so convoluted, the people who are involved. There have been men arrested for the killing. They were former police officers, and the investigation now seems to suggest that many local politicians in Rio were a part of some sort of militia, some sort of local militia that was responsible for her killing. One of the guys who was perceived to have been, actually may have pulled the trigger, I believe is like a neighbor of Bolsonaro. There could be connections with Bolsonaro's son. It's all very, it's hard for me to wrap my brain around what's the investigation is revealing at the moment. But in terms of, one of the reasons that are being presented as a potential reason for her killing and why they were organizing and targeting her specifically, there is some suggestion that it was based upon a proyecto ley. The translation would be like a bill, a local bill, in order to grant folks who live in the so-called favela communities property deeds. So if you've heard of favela communities, these are communities in which folks kind of just take the land themselves, build their homes themselves. They often don't have a lot of social services, but they're not officially a part of urban planning, and many people in those communities still don't have property deeds, so they legally don't own their land. And Marielle was trying to push forth a law that would grant folks in particular favela communities property deeds. And it turns out that that was also where some of the folks who were suspected of being involved in her murder wanted to, bring in some sort of developer and create, some sort of capitalist, moradia, residential area for the middle class Brazilians. And these are, much of this is still sort of speculation. The investigation hasn't completed, but these are the things that are circulating around why she was targeted. And it was, such a huge shock to so many people because it's very difficult and has been difficult in Brazilian history to see an Afro-Brazilian woman assume power in the way that she did, an Afro-Brazilian who represented the needs of the Black community For instance, some things that one of the other policies that she fought for was for single mothers, well, not just single mothers, but for the daycare centers to stay open until late at night, because she understood that in many of these communities where there were single mothers who went to work and had to take public transportation 2 or 3 hours to and from work, they could not come home in time to pick up their children. So she focused on issues that really affected folks in the community in ways that other politicians have historically ignored. And again, as I said, because of these local and community educational initiatives, she was able to go to college and be in the position to be elected. So it's seen as a tragedy. And again, especially because it was happening in the context of the rise of Bolsonaro, who was someone who was very unabashed in terms of just having white men politicians and not having any sort of racial representation in terms of his cabinet, in terms of his government, and doesn't ever try to represent ideals of racial equality, and speaks actually very openly against racial equality, and is very openly racist in so many ways. The kind of parallel of the rise of Bolsonaro and the fall of Marielle, if you will, was something that really hit to the hearts of many Brazilian people. And again, was something that resonated internationally as well.
Jessica, thank you. we're gonna move toward closing and wrapping up, but I wanted to ask Stuart, maybe a kind of, by way of moving us toward closing, you tell a long history, and it's a history, unfortunately, that isn't filled necessarily with a lot of popular victories. But I'm eager, I guess this is really open to everybody. Are there moments of resistance abroad that people in the United States can take up and can look at and can learn more about, I think, to get a sense of how to push back against this kind of monster of state violence and militarized, aggressive, and racist policing?
Yeah, it's interesting that we're talking about this today, because today is an anniversary. It's the 50th anniversary of a publication of an article in Life magazine that revealed that there were these really terrible prison conditions in South Vietnam. And the prisons in South Vietnam, they were run by the government of the Republic of Vietnam, but they were basically funded by the United States. And there were U.S. advisors of the type of people that I look at in my research who were helping to operate these prisons. There were people held in what were called tiger cages. There were these really tiny cells, and people were shackled to the floor, and a bunch of people were crowded together in these tiny cells. And supposedly they were used for disciplinary isolation. So that in some ways they were similar to what, in a place like San Quentin would be called the hole. But instead of solitary confinement, they crowded a bunch of people in them, including teenagers. And so these photos were published on July 17th, 1970. And they were leaked by somebody who worked actually for Congress, for US Congress. Because this guy thought that there was basically going to be a whitewash in Congress, because Congress knew about it, but didn't really want to make a big stink about it. So he leaked the photos, and it ultimately led to, a real brouhaha in the media. And activists took hold of this story and really ran with it. And it was a moment when the peace movement, the anti-imperialist movement, the anti-war movement, and the decarceration movement, or the anti-prison movement, all kind of worked together. And, at the time there were people, members of the Black Panther Party who were saying, hey, you know what, these conditions in this prison in South Vietnam and the conditions in prisons in California are similar. And then it turned out that in fact, actually there was a guard from San Quentin who was working in this prison in Vietnam. And so these movements all kind of came together and saw a common cause. And ultimately the result of activism that focused on this issue, that really came into the public eye 50 years ago today, was that it helped to push the anti-war movement forward to end the US war in Vietnam. And it also specifically ended the program of assisting prisons and police in other countries that I focus on in my research. So Vietnam wasn't the only country that got this type of prison assistance. Other countries did as well. And that all came to an end because of the work of these activists who, you know, they worked with people in Congress as well. And so that was a real win. It was a success. It was you know, they defunded police. They defunded this prison assistance program. But of course, it's also a cautionary tale because it came back to life. That program was revivified in some ways, and today it's happening, you know, on an even larger scale, perhaps than it was happening, you know, back in the early 1970s. So it's an interesting moment to think about. It's an interesting anniversary, and you know, it provides us with some lessons about solidarity and finding commonalities across different struggles. And it also, you know, I think gives us pause to think about ways that, you know, no win is a final win. There's always future struggles to continue because, you know, these forces of social control and repression are not going to give up easily. So I wrote a brief little piece about this story that came out today. So I'll put it in the chat so people can read the story and learn more about this. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Jose, do you want to touch on current conditions in Puerto Rico and what maybe people here could look to or try to learn from or see or follow?
I mean, it's not all doom and gloom. There's a lot of silver linings coming from the organizing that happened in response to the hurricane when the state just completely failed at their core mission, which is supposed to be to maintain life, right? In their claim to why do you need a government, right? They failed, and you had autonomous community organizing picking up that role, and people realized that they have a power as a civil society that does not need to go through the state, right? So that was a good learning moment. There's also a booming, you know, Afro-Puerto Rican pride and power movement right now, unlike what has ever happened in Puerto Rico. It's ironic because that kind of movement has happened in Brazil for a long time, or in different moments, right? Going back to the early 20th century, at least. I don't know too much about Brazilian history, but Jessica could tell us. I know from Cuban history, and in Cuba, that was already happening in the late 19th century. Cuba and Puerto Rico have always had a very close relationship up until the Cold War, right? And, you know, this year or last year, for the first time, there was the creation of a Afro-Boricua political and cultural magazine, you know, and I was talking to the editor of it, and I told her, you realize that this happened in Cuba more than 100 years ago, right? And this is the first time happening in the 21st century in Puerto Rico, right? So, I mean, there are a couple of things that are changing. You know, obviously there's more Puerto Ricans living in the US mainland now than in Puerto Rico. And I'm worried about what's happening to us over here, and we're all spread out in different places. You know, Florida does weird things to people. And all of a sudden, you know, you have folks thinking that with Puerto Ricans moving to Florida, it was gonna change the politics of the state. But, you know, it shows how much of politics is a bubble effect, you know, and now you have Puerto Ricans becoming more politically conservative just by living in Florida for a couple of years. And you know, these issues of police violence and of incarceration affect us deeply over here. It affects Latinx folks across the board, but it especially affects Afro-Latinx folks, of which the majority of them are from the Spanish-speaking Caribbean, including Puerto Rico. So hopefully, you know, there will be an Afro-Latinx, you know, continuation of Black Lives Matter activism that can also cut across. One thing that I didn't mention, just to end with this, is also another source of resistance in Puerto Rico are Dominicans and other Caribbean immigrants who are particularly targeted by police. And, you know, by virtue of them being criminalized both as immigrants and also as Afro-Latinx folks, they have pushed back greatly against the police, but they've usually done that solo. So hopefully there will also be more solidarity between the small budding movement of Black Lives Matter in Puerto Rico by Puerto Ricans and Dominicans, and people will see those connections. And in the end, it's really about how we can grow that critical mass and how we can account for the differences in our struggles and our positionalities, but also see each other as kin, see each other as people that are accountable to each other and that should sacrifice for each other, and get rid of these tribalisms that their whole point of them was originally to facilitate colonialism and facilitate the taking of land and the enslavement of people, and how we can decompartmentalize ourselves responsibly, right? So that we are attuned to each other's specificities in our oppressions, but also pull in the same direction. I really do have hope that the 21st century is gonna really change how we do those things, you know, in all these communities. And it's just a matter of pushing hard so that it happens as quickly as possible, because, you know, we don't have another 100 years to wait around for this to happen. We need to do it now.
Man, I could not have said it better. I don't think there's any way that we could have wrapped it up in the way that you did, Jose. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Stuart, Dr. Jessica. Again, I'm just so honored to have the opportunity to have such amazing people. Each time we do one of these, I wish that, like, man, like really, because each of you deserve an hour and a half at the very least. But again, thank you so much. To attendees, we are going to be sending out a document with links to books and resources that all of the panelists mentioned. Just a quick, I have 2 books that I could definitely recommend. Badges Without Borders by Dr. Stuart Schrader, and Shifting the Meaning of Democracy. Y'all, buy the books, buy the books. We'll be sending out a link to this recording. Thank you everybody for staying on a little bit extra. I know we all have things to do on a Friday night. Y'all rock. All power to the people.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks so much.
Bye, Danny.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, Jessica. Good to see you again.
Good to see you
Nice
too.
to meet you, Stuart.
Nice to meet you all.
Take care.